Hi, class. I'm Professor McDonough, and I'm so excited to pick up on our discussion from last week of critical race theory. And now you are starting to understand more about what critical race theory is, this lens, this framework through which we can view the world and understand how it is impacted by race and racism. So I hope you're understanding the readings that we've assigned for you. And I also hope that the supplemental materials that we've provided for you, the videos and animations, are adding to and enhancing your understanding of the topics in this course. As always, if you need anything, please feel free to reach out. So let's get started with our discussion for today. We talked last time about critical race theory, and we tried to enhance our understanding of it. This is sort of the outline for the presentation, the history, central concepts of critical race theory, applications, frequent misunderstandings, and then, of course, any questions you may have, put them here in the comments, shoot me a message on Blackboard, or send me an email. So let's talk more about the history of critical race theory. We learned that the father of critical race theory was Derek Bell, is Derek Bell. He developed a lot of these foundational ideas that we now know and label as critical race theory. And his books are still studied widely in universities all around the world. So the inspiration was sort of this uninspiring result of Brown versus Board of Education. And I'm sure even before this, Derek Bell was thinking. He was looking at society. He was looking at the progress or perhaps the lack thereof. And he probably saw some issues. But this Brown versus Board of Education, this exemplar case on school desegregation, Bell found particularly troubling. So he started looking at society, critically examining it, critically examining the legal precedent. That means the cases that came before Brown versus Board and the NAACP's role in that case. And what he came up with was that it seemed like nothing had really changed in society. Although this progress had been made, the law had changed. However, actually in society, nothing had gotten better. This goal of racial equality that Martin Luther King was so eloquently leading a struggle toward, that goal, it seemed possible. And even if that goal wasn't feasible, meaning even if it was difficult or not really workable, not readily workable, even if society wasn't ready for it, even if it was going to be hard to implement. In the 60s, during that civil rights movement, there was a fervor, a commitment, a deep message of commitment to this courageous struggle, no matter what the circumstances and no matter what the odds. Moreover, there was this importance to speak the truth, no matter how many people it alienated, even if that truth seemed to go against this greater goal of unification, and even if that truth upset minds rather than calmed hearts and made the speaker, the person who was telling the truth, subject to censure, subject to people saying, don't say that. Don't say that that way. Even though the truth may cause, or at that time might have caused some backlash from certain people, certain groups, it was important and widely understood that it was by Dr. King and even by Derek Bell that it was an important part of that struggle to speak the truth, regardless of what the costs of that truth were. And so, in keeping with that truth that Derek Bell spoke, and even the truth that Dr. King spoke, these particular individuals, these academics, developed and founded this idea of critical race theory. And so these are four people that you're absolutely going to want to know. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw from Columbia Law School developed this idea of intersectionality, Professor Richard Delgado from University of Alabama School of Law specifically worked with this idea of Latinos and how they fit in this critical race theory picture. Similarly, Professor Mari Matsuda, an Asian crit, Asian crit. And then there's Professor Charles Lawrence III from Georgetown Law School in the work of anti-discrimination law. And between these four, and then the body of work that Derek Bell did, we have a tremendous amount of understanding, information, and thought around this idea of critical race theory. And they helped make this a well-developed and solidified idea. So let's talk about some of what they came up with. The central concepts of critical race theory. Critical race theory is a critical analysis of race in the United States. It is a critical analysis. Well, what does that mean, critical? We see critical in the word critique. It is a way of looking with a sharper eye, a close analysis, a picking apart, if you will, of race in the United States. That's mean we're looking at race and we're looking for race to determine how it impacts certain structures and systems. And then there's this idea that racism is the father of race and not the other way around. Racism is the father of race and not the other way around. Race is only a tool for racism to work. Racism is the system. Racism is what divides people into hierarchies. Racism is the system. And at any point, we will learn as we talk about this more, at any point in the history of this country, someone could have been labeled Black or white, who later was taken out of that category. So at a point in history, Latinos were not white. And then Latinos were white again. And then Latinos were not white. At a point in history, Asians were considered Black people and then considered their own classification of Asians. At any point in history, certain people with African blood were not considered Black, maybe because of how they looked, or maybe because of how they were able to pass for certain races, depending on their geographic positioning in the United States. So whether someone is Black or whether someone is white changes. That classification changes. People's race over the years has changed. I know we wake up and we think, I'm a Black woman. I'm a white woman. I'm a Latino male. I am a Black male. I'm an Asian woman. I'm an Asian male. We think that. However, if we examine, when we examine society, we will see that these classifications over the years have changed. So race itself is fluid and always moving, but racism is static. Racism is that system of using race to classify, of using race to separate, of using race to otherize. So it's racism that gave birth to race. We had to put people into various racial categories. We had to create race in order to make racism function. So racism is the father of race and not the other way around. And so there is a more focused and broad definition of critical race theory, more focused because it is that sort of academic definition, but more broad just because it encompasses some of these ideas that we've been talking about, but puts them all cohesively into this little paragraph. So critical race theory is a theoretical approach and framework of legal analysis. You know, one myth we'll talk about is that people think that K through 12 schools are teaching critical race theory, when that is in fact not the case. Critical race theory is a framework of legal analysis. So it's really taught in the university level and also in law schools around the country. And it's based on this premise that race is not natural or biological feature of humanity. Race is not a natural or biological feature of humanity. That means there is nothing that separates me biologically or naturally in my nature from a white man. Race is not a natural or biological feature of humanity. There is no genetic difference between the races. So if race is not a biological category, if there is no scientific difference between Black people and white people, then it must have been constructed. It must be a sociological tool, a tool of society, a construction to use to organize a society, a certain way for the purpose of dictating and maintaining certain political, social, and economic objectives and disparities. If race is not biological, then it must be a social tool, a sociological tool to separate, to organize, to put people into in groups and out groups in order to achieve certain economic objectives, in order to make money, in order to gain money, and in order to keep some other people from gaining money. And that's this idea of material determinism. Remember these words, this phrase, material determinism. And we'll talk about that even more later. These societal objectives are carried out. These societal objectives of racism, of race, are carried out through the implementation of social systems, structures, and practices that are created to maintain established inequalities. The inequalities in our system are established. They are there. And race is a tool that helps us keep those inequalities there. So, some important tenets of critical race theory before we end. That race is a social and political construct. Neither God nor nature created race. Race is man-made. There are people of different skin colors all over the world. There are people who have the same skin color, who have different skin color, people within various racial groups and within different racial groups that have similar or not similar skin colors. It's a broad spectrum. People vary from very light to very dark. There's nothing biological about it, and it doesn't really matter from a genetic standpoint. Race is man-made, and it is a social phenomenon that is the result of social policies intended to control power, to control resources, and to control opportunity. And racism is normal. Racism is ordinary. I know that hurts a little bit. And I think that when we hear that racism is normal, we think, but racism is horrible. But racism is awful. But people shouldn't be racist. But also understand that the United States was built on these policies and practices. Understand that the founding fathers of this country, those who wrote the Constitution, those who wrote the Declaration of Independence, those who wrote all men are created equal, at the very same time owned slaves. At the very same time owned people. And because of that, they had to know that all men were not equal, at least under their system. They had to know that all men were not getting an opportunity at life, at liberty. They were slaves, not at life, not at liberty, not at the pursuit of happiness. Yet they still said these things. And why? It's because racism is normal. It was built into the policies and practices that were intended to create disadvantages for some. Those were the wealthy property owners at the time, the white and wealthy property owners at that time. The system was designed to create advantages for them at the expense of the African slaves and any others who the system of racism felt needed to be used for that purpose at any given time in history. So racism is normal. Racism is normal. That doesn't mean that I want anyone to go out and say racist things or say offensive, bigoted things, But just know that in our society, in our government, in our laws, racism is normal and embedded there. Race is intersectional. Intersectional. Our system of racism is inextricably linked. We cannot separate it from other categories of oppression like gender, class, disability, and religion. That was our scholar, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, that we saw on the past slide. Race was intersectional. She really did a lot of work to talk about how race intersects with other sorts of categories, and how you may endure even more levels of oppression if you are a member of multiple of those categories of oppression or of those marginalized communities of people. And then there's this idea of differential racialization. Differential racialization, and I've touched on that as I've sort of been talking along, but that race and racism morph. You know, they are chameleons. They take on different shapes at different times in order to serve the interests of the dominant class. At any point in time, racial classification can change, will change, has changed, depending on how that serves the dominant class. And as we get more into these themes, we'll talk about them more, and we'll talk about just how these tenets of critical race theory have shown up in history and even how they show up in our very lives. I hope this lecture has been helpful. And again, if you need anything, please feel free to reach out via email, via Blackboard, or just send me a message in the comments or leave me a comment on this video, and I would be more than happy to chit chat with you. Thank you so much for taking the class, and I'll see you next time.